The last coin she owned was cold against her palm. Kate felt it, that small, worn copper disc, the way you feel something when you already know you're about to lose it. She'd carried it for 3 weeks inside the hem of her apron, sewn there by her own hands the night she'd fled the Harwick estate with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bruise still yellowing along her jaw. She'd told herself it was for bread. Then she'd told herself it was for passage south. Now she stood in the back of a torchlit auction hall that smelled of sawdust, tallow smoke, and something older and darker underneath, something animal. And she understood that coin had never belonged to her plans at all. It had been waiting for tonight. The hall was long and low-ceilinged, carved from stone that wept moisture in the autumn cold. Torches lined the walls in iron brackets, throwing orange light across the faces of perhaps 40 men, merchants, landowners, 2 men in the deep green cloaks of the border guard, and at least one she recognized as a debt collector from the lower quarter. They all leaned forward with the same expression, hunger wearing the mask of business. Kate stood near the back wall where the maids and hired hands gathered to watch, invisible the way servants learn to be invisible. Her linen dress was the color of old wheat, simple and worn soft from too many washings, cinched at the waist with a plain leather belt. Over it she wore her only cloak, gray wool, hooded, the clasp at the throat a dull bronze pin that had belonged to her mother. Her hair, pale gold, was braided down her back in a single long plait, loose strands escaping at her temples in the damp cold of the hall. She was 23 years old and had spent every one of those years learning that the safest place in any room was the one where no one thought to look. She should not have been here. She had only come because Dora, the laundress from the inn, had told her the auction tonight wasn't for goods or land. "They're selling a man," Dora had whispered over the washing basin that morning, her eyes wide and a little too bright. "Captured 2 days north of Ashfen, they say. Came down off the ridge alone. The border men caught him in a snare meant for elk." She'd laughed, nervous, then dropped her voice further. "They say he's one of the wolf-kin." Kate had said nothing. She'd wrung out the linen in her hands and hung it on the line and tried not to think about it. But here she was. The auctioneer, a thin man with a waxed mustache and ink-stained fingers, gestured toward the far end of the platform, and 2 guards dragged the chains forward. The man at the end of those chains made the guards look like boys. He stood well over 6 feet, built in the way of someone who had been shaped by years of terrain and hardship rather than training yards. His hair was dark, nearly black, worn in long braids that fell past his shoulders, several strands matted at the left temple where dried blood had crusted. A torn leather vest hung from his frame, dark and cracked, the kind of hide that had been worn through many seasons. Leather bracers still clung to his forearms beneath the iron cuffs, and the remains of a broad belt crossed his torso. Its buckle bent from the fight that had brought him here. His shoulders were wrapped in what had once been a heavy fur mantle, now torn at one side, dragging on the platform behind him like something he refused to let go of, even in chains. His wrists were bound in iron cuffs linked to a bar the guards held between them, and even so, even barefoot on cold stone, in a hall that smelled of cheap tallow and wet wool, he carried himself as though the room were beneath him. Which, Kate realized slowly, it probably was. His eyes moved across the crowd with no expression at all. Not fear, not anger. Something more dangerous than either. Assessment. He was counting exits. She could tell by the way his gaze swept the walls before it settled, briefly, on each face. The eyes themselves were pale blue, startling against the darkness of his hair and the bronze of his skin, the color of winter sky just before a storm decides what it wants to do. When that gaze reached the back of the hall, it passed over the cluster of servants without pausing. Except, for just a half second, it paused on her. Kate looked down at her hands. 200 silvers, the auctioneer called, and the bidding began. She didn't understand at first what bothered her about it. The men bid with the casual cruelty of those who've never had to think carefully about money, and the number climbed. 250, 300, 320. And the man on the platform stood very still. And Kate watched, and something in her chest pulled tight like a thread being drawn too fast through cloth. Then the guard on the left shifted, and she saw it. The iron cuff on his right wrist had been fitted wrong, or had been damaged, or perhaps he'd worked at it for 2 days in whatever hole they'd kept him in, and the inner edge had cut into the skin repeatedly. The wound was not small. It had gone deep and been ignored, and the flesh around it was swollen and dark in a way that meant rot was already beginning. In this cold, in chains, with no treatment, a wound like that could kill a man inside a week. 400, said a heavy-set merchant in a fur-lined coat, and several men dropped out. Kate's hand closed around the coin. She was not a foolish woman. She knew what a copper coin was worth against 400 silver. She knew what she was, a dismissed housemaid with no references, no family, no patron, and 4 nights left at the inn before her credit ran out. She knew that whatever happened to a wolfkin sold at auction in a hall like this one, it was not her problem and not her business, and not something 1 copper coin could fix. She also knew that wound. She'd seen infection take her younger brother when she was 12, and she had spent the 11 years since recognizing the exact color of skin when it was beginning to lose the argument with death. 450, said one of the border guards. Kate's feet moved before she'd made a decision. She pushed through the edge of the crowd, quietly, the way servants move, slipping between bodies without touching them, until she reached the side of the hall where the auctioneer's assistant stood with his ledger. She tapped his sleeve. He turned with the expression of a man interrupted during something important. What? The prisoner's wrist, she said, keeping her voice low and even. The right one. The cuff has infected it. If whoever buys him doesn't treat it before morning, they'll own a corpse by the end of the week. The assistant stared at her. And I have a coin. She opened her hand. The copper disc sat in her palm, dull and small and absurd. I'm not bidding. I only want to treat the wound. Let me through after the sale. He looked at the coin. He looked at her. He laughed. Not cruelly, just the laugh of someone surprised by something genuinely ridiculous. And then he shrugged and turned back to his ledger. It was not a yes. It was not a no. Kate decided to treat it as a yes. 500, said the fur-lined merchant, and the hall went quiet. The auctioneer waited. No counter came. He raised his gavel. Kate was already moving toward the side door that led to the holding rooms. She heard the gavel fall behind her. The holding room was small and smelled of straw and iron and the particular cold that lives inside stone walls in autumn. A single torch burned in a bracket near the door. The chains had been fastened to a ring in the wall, and the man sat on the floor with his back against the stone and his wrists resting on his knees, the infected one upward, as if he'd already decided to manage the pain through stillness rather than struggle. Up close, the torn fur at his shoulder was wolf hide, she realized, old and well kept before the damage. The braids in his dark hair were bound at the ends with small rings of dark iron, the kind worn by men who came from places with their own customs and their own laws. He watched her come through the door with the same expression he'd worn on the platform. Assessment. Distance. Kate knelt beside him without asking permission. She uncapped her small tin of rendered fat mixed with dried yarrow, a habit from her years at the Harwick estate, where the old cook had taught her useful things. The smell of yarrow lifted sharp and green over the iron and blood. I'm not going to hurt you, she said. Not because she thought he was afraid. Because it was honest. He said nothing. She cleaned the wound carefully, and he didn't flinch. She was wrapping the linen around his wrist in a firm, even spiral when his voice came, low and rough from disuse, resonant in the way of something accustomed to carrying across open distance. Why? Not quite a question. The word stripped bare, She understood he didn't mean why treat it. He meant why are you here at all? Kate sat back on her heels and looked at him. His pale blue eyes were fixed on her face with an attention that was almost uncomfortable. Not threatening, but complete. The kind of attention most people reserved for things they considered important. Because the wound was going to kill you, she said. And I know what that looks like. A long silence passed between them. You spent your last coin, he said. A statement. She looked down at her empty palm. Yes. For a stranger. For a wound, she corrected quietly. That's all. She stood and tucked the tin back into her apron pocket. She didn't know what she expected. Nothing, probably. She turned to leave. What is your name? She paused at the door. The torchlight caught the loose strands of her pale braid, and for a moment the cold stone room felt very small. Kate, she said, without turning around. She walked out into the cold. She did not look back. She had no way of knowing that in the morning, the fur-lined merchant would arrive to collect his purchase and find the holding room empty, chains on the floor, the iron ring pulled clean from the wall, and no sign of the man who had cost him 500 silver. She had no way of knowing that she would be the first person he looked for. The morning came in gray and wet. The kind of autumn dawn that doesn't so much arrive as seep. Fog rolling off the river in slow curls, settling between the inn's timber walls and the muddy lane outside, like something that had decided to stay. Kate was awake before the light. She had not slept well. The straw mattress in the servants' loft was thin, and the blanket thinner, and somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, she had lain on her back staring at the rafters and thinking about pale blue eyes that had looked at her like she was worth looking at. She told herself it was the cold keeping her awake. She was practical enough to know she was lying. By the time the inn's kitchen fire was lit, and the bread dough set to rise, she had pushed the memory of the holding room into the back of her mind and returned to the immediate problem of her situation, which was this: 4 nights of credit remaining, no position, no references, and winter coming in hard from the north. The innkeeper, a broad woman named Marta, who was not unkind but was very practical, had already mentioned twice that the loft space was needed for paying guests come the cold season. Kate was scrubbing the long kitchen table when she heard the commotion in the yard. Voices, more than one, and the kind that carried authority without needing to raise themselves. She heard boots on stone, the particular sound of a door being opened by someone who did not wait to be invited. Then Marta's voice, sharp with surprise and something underneath it that Kate had never heard from the woman before. Something that sounded like fear. Kate set down her brush. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked into the common room, and stopped. There were 4 of them. Large men, all of them, dressed in dark traveling leathers, road-worn but well-made, the kind of gear that belonged to people who covered distances and meant to keep covering them. 2 stood near the door. One was speaking quietly to Marta, who had gone the color of old ash. And the 4th stood slightly apart from the others, near the cold hearth, and was looking directly at Kate. He was not the same man she had seen in chains. He was, and he wasn't. The braids were the same, dark, iron-ringed, falling past his shoulders. The pale blue eyes were the same. The breadth of him, the particular way he occupied space as if the room had been built around him rather than the other way around, was the same. But he had been cleaned and dressed and fed, and what had been visible as power through damage and chains was now simply present, undeniable. A dark leather vest crossed with broad straps at his chest, bracers on both forearms, a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders that was whole and well kept. The improvised linen bandage on his right wrist was the only familiar thing, still wrapped exactly as she had left it. His expression, watching her from across the room, was unreadable. Kate's first instinct, the one built by years of service and 3 weeks of running, was to step back into the kitchen, remove herself from whatever this was, and find a reason to be elsewhere. She had learned early that when powerful men came looking for something in a room she was in, the wisest thing a woman in her position could do was become invisible. She was halfway through that instinct when she stopped herself. He had already seen her. He had, in fact, come here for her specifically. That much was clear from the way the other men had positioned themselves, from the way Marta was answering questions and glancing toward the kitchen door. There was no invisible left to be. So Kate straightened her spine, folded her hands in front of her the way she'd learned to do when standing before people who held her employment in their palms, and walked into the common room. The man speaking to Marta stopped. Marta exhaled with visible relief at having someone else to pass the situation to. The two men near the door didn't move, but their attention shifted to Kate, with the focused quality of people trained to track threats, reassessing and filing her away in the same moment. Evander, she still did not know his name, not yet, said nothing. He watched her cross the room with the same complete attention he'd given her in the holding room, and it occurred to her, uncomfortably, that he looked at everything this way, as if the world were a text, and he were reading it. She stopped at a reasonable distance and met his gaze. "You're not dead," she said, because it was the first true thing she could think of. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one, gone before it finished arriving. "Not dead," he agreed. His voice was the same, low, carrying, rougher than she'd expected from someone who looked like this, cleaned and whole and standing in a country inn like he'd been there 100 times. "The merchant will be looking for you," Kate said. "The merchant has been compensated." She absorbed this. How? Triple what he paid. He said it the way someone says the sky is gray, factual, indifferent to her reaction. He was not difficult to satisfy. Kate looked at the bandage on his wrist. The linen was still clean, which meant the wound hadn't wept through the night, which was a good sign. "You should change that dressing this morning," she said, "and you'll need to keep it dry for at least 4 days." "I know." "Do you?" She said it without sharpness, only with the mild skepticism of someone who has watched many people claim knowledge of their own medical needs and then immediately ignore them. This time, the not-quite smile reached slightly further. "I heal faster than you might expect." "Everyone says that." The man who had been speaking to Marta made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. He was younger than the others, with a reddish beard and an open face that didn't match the controlled wariness of his companions. He caught Kate's eye, and then looked away with suspicious speed. Evander's gaze, which had not moved from her face, finally shifted. A brief glance toward the man with the reddish beard that seemed to communicate something without words, because the man straightened immediately and went back to looking like a professional. "You have no position," Evander said, returning to Kate. Not a question. He had learned it the same way he'd learned about the coin, by listening to things not meant for him. Kate kept her chin level. "Not at the moment. And you leave this inn in 4 days." 3, Marta said helpfully from behind the bar, and then went very quiet when Kate looked at her. 3 days, Kate amended. Evander was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the sound of the town going about its morning, cartwheels on cobblestone, a dog barking twice and stopping, the distant cry of the bread seller, came through the walls in a muffled, ordinary way. Ordinary, as if this were a normal morning and not whatever it actually was. "I am returning north," he said, "to Veldrath. The journey is 12 days by the road through Ashfin, 8 across the ridge." He paused. "My company requires someone with knowledge of field medicine. The man who held that role is not returning with us." Kate looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the 4 men arranged in his company, large, capable, armed, every one of them in better health than any patient she'd ever treated. "Your men look well enough to me." "They are," he said, "at present." She understood what he was not saying. A company traveling hard through ridge country in autumn, into whatever waited for them in Veldrath, would not stay well indefinitely. "I'm a housemaid," she said, "not a physician." "You diagnosed an infected wound in torchlight from 30 feet away," he said, "and treated it correctly with what you had in your pocket." She had no immediate answer for that. "You would be compensated," he said, "fairly, and given safe passage wherever you choose to go after Veldrath, with a written reference." He said the last part as if he knew exactly what weight those 2 words carried for a woman in her position, and Kate felt something careful and complicated move through her chest, because he was right. A written reference from whoever he was would be worth more than 6 months of wages. She didn't know who he was yet. She was beginning to understand that she should probably find out. "I don't know your name," she said. The young man with the reddish beard made the suppressed laugh sound again, and was silenced by nothing more than the slight angle of Evander's head in his direction. "Evander," he said. And then, after a pause that felt deliberate, like a door opening only as far as necessary, "of the Veldrath Pack." The words landed in the room with a particular weight. Kate saw Marta grip the edge of the bar. She heard one of the men near the door shift his boots on the flagstone. She kept her own expression still by habit, and thought about what she knew of Veldrath, which was not much, only what anyone in the border towns knew, which was that the territory beyond Ashfen Ridge was Wolfkin land, old and vast and governed by its own laws, and that the Alpha of Veldrath had not come south of the ridge in 11 years, and that his name was spoken carefully even by men who didn't believe in being careful. She looked at the bandage on his wrist, the one she had wrapped with yarrow and rendered fat and a strip of her own apron hem. "For a wound," she had said. "That's all." She had spent her last coin on the Alpha King. Kate unfolded her hands and smoothed the front of her linen dress with 2 flat palms, a gesture that meant, in the language of her own body, that she had made a decision and was done second-guessing it. "I'll need my tin back," she said, "and my cloak. And if we're crossing the ridge, I'll want proper boots before we leave town. Mine won't last 8 days on that terrain." Something in Evander's pale eyes shifted, barely, briefly, the way still water moves when something breaks the surface from beneath. "Done," he said. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. The boots were good ones, stiff brown leather, thick-soled, lined with wool at the ankle. The cobbler on the market lane had looked at Evander's man, the one with the reddish beard whose name turned out to be Rowan, and produced them from the back room without being asked twice. Kate had watched this transaction with the quiet attention she gave to everything, and understood something she would keep returning to over the days that followed. People who lived near the ridge knew what it meant when men dressed like this came through town. They knew, and they moved accordingly, not with fear exactly, but with the careful respect of those who have learned the difference between a storm that will pass overhead and one that will come through the valley. She did not find it reassuring. She found it informative. They left before midday, while the fog was still burning off the lower fields. 5 of them. Evander, Rowan, and 2 others she came to know as Cale and Davin, both quiet men in the way of those who communicate mostly through positioning and silence. And Kate, in her gray cloak and new boots, her small bundle of belongings tied across her back with a leather strap. She had packed everything she owned in under 10 minutes, which had not been difficult. She did not own very much. The road north was hard-packed clay turned soft by recent rain, and the horses, dark, heavy animals, built for ridge terrain rather than speed, moved through it with steady indifference. Kate rode behind Rowan, who had offered his horse with the cheerful efficiency of someone following an instruction he didn't mind following. Evander rode ahead, slightly apart from the others in the way of someone accustomed to setting his own pace and having others adjust to it. She studied the back of him as they rode. The fur mantle, the dark braids, the straight line of his spine that didn't move with the horse so much as absorb it. He had said perhaps 30 words to her since the inn, and none of them had been unnecessary. Rowan, by contrast, had said approximately 300. He doesn't usually do this, Rowan said about an hour out of town, with the tone of someone resuming a thought he'd been turning over for a while. Do what? Kate said. Explain himself. Rowan glanced sideways at her, then forward again. He had an honest face. Broad, freckled across the nose, the reddish beard trimmed close on the jaw. She put him at perhaps 25, younger than the others by several years. When he wants something done, he says so. He doesn't usually tell people why. Kate considered this. The road curved north through bare-limbed oak trees, their branches black against the pale sky. He didn't tell me why, she said. He told me the facts. Rowan opened his mouth, closed it, thought about this with visible effort. I suppose that's true, he admitted. Has someone actually been hurt? She asked. The man who held the medical roll. What happened to him? The openness in Rowan's face changed slightly. Not closed. He wasn't a man built for closing. But something moved behind his eyes that was more careful than his usual expression. He left, Rowan said. Before we came south. Left. Yes. She waited. Rowan looked forward at the road and said nothing else. And she understood that left was the word they had agreed to use, and that it was covering something heavier, and that she would not learn what that was today. Ahead, without turning, Evander said, The bridge at Carden Ford will be iced over by nightfall. We take the mill path instead. Cale, just behind him, adjusted his direction without a word. Davin followed. Rowan followed, and Kate followed Rowan, and none of them asked how Evander had known about the bridge or the ice when they were still 2 hours from the ford. She tucked this away alongside the other things she was gathering. They camped the first night at the edge of a pine wood, where the ground was dry under the canopy, and the smell of resin lay over everything like a clean blanket. Cale built the fire with the speed of someone who has done it 10,000 times. Dry pine needles, then small sticks, then larger wood, the whole thing caught and going in under 2 minutes. Davin produced food from the saddlebags, hard bread, dried meat, a cloth-wrapped piece of hard yellow cheese, a small crock of preserved apple. Simple. Enough. Kate ate and said little. The men ate and said less. Evander sat slightly back from the fire on a flat-topped stone, and she noticed he ate last, after the others had taken their portions, and that this seemed to be customary rather than incidental. After supper, she checked his wrist by firelight, unwrapping the linen with careful fingers. The wound looked better than she'd expected. Significantly better, in fact. The dark swelling that had been creeping up toward his forearm at the auction had retreated, the skin less angry, the deep cut beginning to close at the edges in a way that should have taken 3 days, but appeared to have taken 1. She kept her expression neutral. You do heal faster, she said. I told you. You did. She applied fresh yarrow from her tin and rewrapped it. His hands were very still while she worked. Large hands, scarred across the knuckles in the overlapping way of someone who has been in many fights. But the stillness itself was deliberate, a form of consideration. She recognized it as such. I'll need to recheck it in 2 days. After that, it should manage itself. Understood. She wound the last of the linen and tied it off. Neither of them moved immediately. The fire crackled. Pine smoke drifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl made its low, repetitive inquiry into the dark. You came south alone, she said. It wasn't a question, but she left space for an answer. A silence. Then, yes. That wasn't wise. The pause that followed this was different from his usual ones, shorter, and with something in it she couldn't identify. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked up. He was watching the fire, his profile sharp in the orange light, the iron rings in his braids catching small, bright points of reflection. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who was tired. Not in the body, but in some deeper register. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. She didn't ask what it was. She put the tin away and moved back to her place by the fire and drew her gray cloak around her shoulders against the night cold. From across the camp, in the direction of the horses, she heard Rowan's voice low and quiet, and Cale's answer, and then silence. The fire breathed. Kate stared into it and thought about Veldrath. What little she knew, which was Wolfkin territory, ridge country, governed by an alpha whose name was spoken carefully. She thought about the auction hall, and the 500 silver and the fur-lined merchant's satisfied expression as the gavel fell. She thought about the holding room, and the chains on the floor, and the iron ring pulled clean from the wall. She thought, a man who can pull a ring from stone with infected wrists in the dark, traveled 2 days south of his own territory, and allowed himself to be captured in a snare meant for elk. She thought, that is not an accident. She did not voice this thought, but she held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure is yours to examine. On the 3rd day they reached Ashfan, the last real town before the ridge road climbed into Wolfkin territory, and something changed. It was subtle at first, the way people on the main road moved to the side as they passed, not in the practical way of townspeople clearing space for horses, but in the deliberate way of people who have decided not to be noticed by someone who might notice them. A woman pulling a cart of cabbages turned her face away. 2 men in front of the tanner's shop stopped their conversation and watched from the corner of their eyes until the horses had passed. Kate saw it. She saw, too, that Rowan's easy manner had gone quiet and watchful, and that Cale had moved his horse to ride closer to Evander's left side, and that Davin had dropped back slightly to ride even with Kate in a way that felt less like companionship and more like coverage. "What is this?" she asked Rowan quietly. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were moving across the street, cataloging. "Ashfan has a new garrison commander," he said finally. "Since 2 months ago. And the old one had an arrangement with Veldrath." He kept his voice low and level. "A mutual understanding, the kind that keeps things quiet. The new one doesn't." "The new one," Rowan said carefully, "has different ideas about the ridge." They were passing the garrison now, a heavy stone building on the corner of the market square, the border guard's green and gray banner hanging above the door. Kate kept her eyes forward. She felt, rather than saw, the 2 guards standing outside the door mark them as they passed. They did not stop. They did not speak. But as the garrison fell behind them and the north road opened ahead, Kate became aware of a specific and unpleasant feeling between her shoulder blades, the feeling of being watched by something that was deciding. "Evander," she said, before she'd decided to speak. He turned in his saddle and looked at her. The first time he had looked back at her directly since they'd left the inn. "The guards outside the garrison," she said. "The one on the right. He sent someone. A beat." "I saw," Evander said. "Do we ride faster?" Something moved in those pale eyes, consideration, and underneath it, something she was only now beginning to learn to read in him, something that was not quite the absence of worry, but was very close to its mastery. "We ride exactly as we are," he said, "until we don't." It was not a reassuring answer. It was, she was beginning to understand, the kind of answer he gave when the truth was complicated, and the time for explaining it was not yet. She settled her hands on the saddle and looked forward at the gray road rising toward the ridge, where the pine trees thickened into darkness and the sky pressed down low and heavy with the promise of the first real snow. Behind them, somewhere in Ashfan, she was nearly certain that a rider had broken away from the garrison yard at a gallop. She did not look back to confirm it. She had learned over 3 days on the road with these men that looking back too often was a way of missing what was coming from ahead. The snow came before they reached the ridge, the way it always does in that country. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a decision. One moment the sky was simply low and gray, pressing down through the pine canopy in cold, colorless light. The next, white was falling in thick, unhurried silence, settling on the dark fur of Evander's mantle, on the horses' manes, on the road ahead, until the road disappeared into itself, and there was only the trees and the white, and the sound of hooves muffled to something barely there. Kate pulled her hood up and kept her eyes on the path. They had left the main road an hour out of Ashfen, turning onto a narrower track that climbed through dense pine in long, switchbacking diagonals. Evander had made the decision without discussion, and no one had questioned it. The track was not well traveled. Branches scraped close on both sides, and in places the horses had to be led single file through gaps in the rock. But it was faster than the open ridge road, and it was the kind of path that did not appear on garrison maps. Kate had understood this without being told. She was getting better at understanding things without being told, in the company of these men. There were 3 riders, Davin said from behind her. It was the most words she had heard him speak in 3 days. He had a quiet, measured voice, and eyes the color of wet slate, and he spoke only when he had already confirmed what he was saying was true. I heard 2 horses, Cale said. 3, Davin said without inflection. Evander didn't turn. Distance? Half an hour. They took the main road first. They'll work out the turn before long. A silence passed through the group in the particular way of people who have made calculations together many times. Kate did her own calculation. Half an hour behind on a road that was filling with snow, against a party that knew where it was going. The numbers were not terrible. They were not comfortable either. Rowan, Evander said. I know the way station, Rowan answered already. 3 miles up, east face of the second ridge. The roof held last winter. Take Kate ahead, Cale and Davin with me. Kate opened her mouth. Evander looked at her over his shoulder with an expression that was not unkind and not negotiable. She closed her mouth. She did not like it. She was honest enough with herself to know that her dislike was not entirely rational. She was not a fighter, she had no weapon, and she had known this man for 3 days. Her presence in whatever was about to happen on a snow-covered mountain track would be, at best, irrelevant, at worst, a liability. She followed Rowan. The way station was a low stone building tucked into the eastern face of the ridge like something the mountain had grown rather than built, its roof weighted with years of moss now hidden under the new snow. Rowan got the door open with the practiced push of someone who had been here before, and the smell that came out was cold pine, old ash, and the particular damp stone smell of a place that has been empty for a season. He had a fire going in 10 minutes. She helped without being asked, finding dry wood stacked under an oilcloth in the corner, feeding it to the flame in careful increments the way the cook at Harwick had taught her. The fire caught and threw orange warmth across rough stone walls, a low wooden table, 2 sleeping pallets along the far wall, a row of iron hooks where nothing currently hung. Kate sat on the edge of one pallet and listened to the snow, and tried not to think about the 3 riders on the track below. Rowan sat across from her on an upturned log, his elbows on his knees, watching the fire with an expression that was working hard at casual and not entirely succeeding. Who are they? Kate asked. Rowan turned a small stick over in his hands. Border Garrison, Commander Aldrich's men. What does he want? The stick turned. Evander, mostly. Why? Rowan looked at her for a moment, measuring, she thought, not what to tell her but how much. He was not a man built for deception, which meant whatever he decided to say would be true. He was only deciding how much truth was his to give. Aldrich has been buying influence along the ridge for 2 years, he said finally. Merchant routes, water rights, the old border posts. Small things, separately. Together, he stopped, started again. Veldrath controls the upper ridge, has for 300 years. Aldrich wants the ridge. Specifically, he wants Evander unable to hold it. Kate absorbed this. And the auction? The stick went still in Rowan's hands. That was not random, she said. It was not a question. Rowan set the stick down on the ground beside his boot. He looked at the fire. We were traveling back from the eastern border. Evander went ahead alone. He does that sometimes. Moves faster than the rest of us. He knows the country better than anyone alive. A pause. The snare that caught him was set on a path that only someone who knew his roots would know to set it on. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow fell without sound. Someone told Aldrich's men where to find him, Kate said. Yes. Someone from Veldrath. Rowan said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Kate sat with this for a moment, the shape of it, the weight. A betrayal from inside. A trap laid on a private path. A captured Alpha King sold at auction in a border town like a seized animal. And somewhere in that chain of events, a dismissed housemaid with an empty pocket who had happened to be in the wrong hall at the right moment. She thought about the man she had knelt beside in a cold holding room, wrists bound, wounded, and she thought about how he had sat very still and assessed her with those pale eyes, and then, instead of dismissing her the way every powerful person she had ever met had dismissed her, had listened. She thought, he trusted me with the wound before he trusted me with any of this. She thought, that is not nothing. Rowan, she said. Yes. The man who left before you came south. The one who held the medical role. She kept her voice even. He didn't leave, did he? Rowan looked at his hands. A long, quiet breath. His name was Ferris, he said. He'd been with the pack for 8 years. He was... Another pause, this one heavier. He was the one who knew the roots. The fire breathed. The stone walls held the cold at bay with modest success, and Kate sat in the warm pocket of the way station with the knowledge she'd just been given, and felt it settle into the other things she had gathered, finding its place. Ferris. 8 years. The roots. The snare set on a private path. She understood now why Rowan's face had done what it did when she'd first asked about him on the road. They heard the horses perhaps 40 minutes later. Not 3 sets of hooves, but 2. Moving up the track with the careful pace of animals negotiating snow in the dark. Kate was on her feet before Rowan was, which earned her a brief, surprised look. She held very still near the door, and listened, and counted the sounds. And then, because the sounds were familiar in a way she had spent 3 days learning, she stepped back from the door and sat down again. Rowan looked at her questioningly. 2 horses, she said. Not 3. He held still. Listened. Something in his face relaxed by one careful degree. The door opened, and cold air and snow came in with Kale and Davin, and behind them Evander, who ducked through the low door frame without breaking stride, and stood in the warmth of the small room, and shook the snow from his mantle with one motion. There was a cut along his left forearm, shallow but recent, the blood already beginning to dry in the cold. Kate stood and crossed to him without thinking about it, which she only realized after she had done it. He looked down at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, still distant, still contained, but with something behind it that was paying close attention. Sit, she said, in the voice she used when she was not asking. He sat. She unwrapped the leather bracer from his left arm and examined the cut by firelight, cleaning it with the corner of a fresh cloth dampened from her water flask. It was not deep. It would not need stitching. She applied the yarrow and bandaged it with the economy of someone working in limited light with limited materials. And through all of this, he was very still in the way she now knew was deliberate, a form of attention, his eyes on her face rather than her hands. The third rider, she said, while she worked. Turned back, Evander said. Alive? A pause. Yes. Will he go back to Aldrich? Yes. She tied off the bandage and sat back. Across the room, Cale was already eating. Davin had taken a position by the window that had nothing casual about it. Rowan was watching Evander with an expression that was trying very hard not to be worried. Kate looked at Evander directly. You let him go, she said. On purpose. Yes. Because you want Aldrich to know where you are. The pale eyes held hers. In the firelight they were less gray, and more the deep blue of winter sky at dusk, and there was something in them that was weighing her. Not her threat or her use, she had come to understand, but her understanding. He was checking whether she had followed the logic. She had. You want him to come to Veldrath, she said, instead of continuing to pick at the edges. A blade that keeps cutting at the bark, Evander said, does not fell the tree. She looked at him for a long moment. But a blade that comes through the front door might. Only if the house is unprepared, he said, and then quietly, it will not be unprepared. Outside, the snow had stopped. Through the way station's single small window, Kate could see the first hard stars of a clearing night appearing above the ridgeline, cold and fixed and indifferent to the plans of men. She wrapped her gray cloak around her shoulders and thought about Veldrath, the pack, the ridge, the betrayal that had come from inside it. And she thought about Commander Aldrich somewhere south of them, receiving the news from a cold and frightened rider, beginning to move his pieces across the board. She thought, I came north to treat wounds. She thought, I have walked into something much larger than a wound. And then, because she was Kate, and she was practical, and she had spent 23 years dealing with what was in front of her, rather than what she wished was in front of her. She put another log on the fire, lay down on the pallet, and slept. Veldrath came into view on the 8th day, just as the last of the snow clouds broke apart, and the afternoon light came through in long, cold shafts that turned the ridge gold and white at the same time. Kate pulled her hood back and looked at it, and felt something happen in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not what she had imagined. She had pictured something severe. A fortress, perhaps, stone walls and iron gates and the kind of architecture that announces itself as a warning. What she saw instead was a settlement that had grown from the ridge itself, as if the mountain had slowly accumulated it over centuries, the way it accumulated rock and root. Timber halls with steep, heavy roofs, stone foundations that followed the natural contours of the terrain, rather than fighting them. Smoke, rising from a dozen fires in the pale afternoon air, smelling of pine and roasting meat and wood smoke and the indefinable warmth of a place where many people have lived for a very long time. It was larger than any map she'd seen had suggested. She suspected that was deliberate. The people came out to meet them before the horses had crested the final rise. Not cautiously, not with the wariness of Ashvin's townspeople, but in the way people move when something they have been quietly afraid of losing has come back. Men and women both, most of them large in the way of Evander's company. Some with the same quality of contained physical force she had learned to recognize over 8 days on the road. A woman of perhaps 50 came through the crowd and stopped in front of Evander's horse, gray at her temples, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who has never needed a title to make a room listen. Her name was Mira, and she managed the hall, and she looked at Kate with sharp brown eyes and said, "The healer's room off the east corridor hasn't been properly stocked in 2 months." She said it with a pointed look at Evander, then walked away before he could respond. Kate liked her immediately. The healer's room had good bones, 2 south-facing windows, a long work table worn smooth with years of use, proper shelving along the inner wall. The shelves were mostly bare. Kate spent the first afternoon taking inventory, and the second morning at Veldrath's trade post 2 miles down the eastern path, moving through the stalls with Mira's written word in her pocket, and the focused attention of someone who has been given a clear task and intends to do it properly. Dried yarrow, comfrey root, willow bark, pine resin. Clean linen in 3 widths, a new blade for the dull knife, rendered tallow in a sealed crock that smelled clean and cold. She carried it back herself, which earned her a look from the trader's boy who had expected to be called upon to help and wasn't. She was reorganizing the lower shelves that evening when Rowan appeared in the doorway. He had the particular brightness of someone sent to check on someone and trying to look like it was his own idea, and after 4 days she had run out of patience for pretending not to notice. "What do you need to tell me?" she said, without turning around. A pause. Then, with some relief, "There's a man named Soren. He was Ferris's closest friend. He's been quiet since Ferris left. We thought grief. But Evander asked me to tell you. Because..." He stopped. "Because Evander has been watching him too," Kate said. "For 3 weeks," Rowan admitted. "No evidence, only a feeling." Kate set down the crock she was holding. "Show me who he is at supper," she said. "Don't tell him I've asked." She saw Soren that evening at the long tables in the main hall. Lean and dark-haired, with quick hands and a face that did nothing obviously wrong. He laughed at the right moments. He passed the bread. He spoke to his neighbors with the ease of long familiarity. None of it was wrong. Except that twice, when conversation near him turned toward Evander's return, his eyes moved, briefly, involuntarily, toward the hall's eastern door, not checking whether it was open, checking whether anyone was coming through it. She watched this and said nothing, and after supper, when the hall had thinned and the fire had settled low, Evander came to sit across the table from her. He set 2 cups of spiced cider between them without ceremony, the way he did everything, as if the action were simply the obvious next thing. She told him what she'd seen. The door. The timing. He listened without interrupting. "He's been told someone is coming," Kate said. "Aldrich isn't waiting for an invitation. He already has someone inside to open the gate." Evander was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ferris and I grew up together, from boys. I knew something had changed in him, 6 months before the auction. I knew, and I chose to believe I was wrong." Kate held the warmth of the cup in both hands. "That's not weakness," she said quietly. "It nearly got me sold to a fur merchant in a border town." "It did," she agreed. "And then a housemaid spent her last coin on your wrist, and here you are." She said it without irony. "We make the best decisions we can with what we know. Then we deal with what actually happens." He looked at her across the firelight, and something in his face, just for a moment, came completely still. Not the controlled stillness she'd learned over 8 days, but the stillness of something that has stopped bracing itself. Then he picked up his cup, and the moment closed. And outside, the first real wind of deep autumn moved through Veldrath's pines like something that had finally arrived. Aldrich's men came 3 nights later. Not through the front. Through the eastern postern gate, the small auxiliary entrance cut into the ridge wall behind the granary, the one that appeared on no garrison map, the one that only someone who had lived inside Veldrath for years would know. It opened, in the deep hours of the night. From the inside, Soren had a torch and a sick, white face and shaking hands, and he was still holding the postern's iron bolt when Cale stepped out of the shadows behind him and took his arm with the quiet finality of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Kate heard the noise from the healer's room, where she had not been sleeping. She had been sitting at the work table by candlelight, listening to the particular quality of the silence outside and recognizing it, after 3 days in Veldrath, as the silence of people who were also not sleeping and were also listening. She had kept her candle lit and her yarrow close, and told herself she was simply being practical. She came into the eastern corridor to find Evander already there. He was fully dressed, which told her he had not slept either. Behind him, Cale held Soren against the wall, not roughly, but with the immovability of someone who does not need to use force to communicate its presence. Beyond the open postern, Kate could hear horses, perhaps 6, moving carefully over the ridge path, slowing as they realized the yard beyond the gate was not empty. Evander stepped through the postern. She heard his voice outside, low, carrying, absolutely calm. And then she heard Commander Aldrich's voice, which was none of those things. It was the voice of a man who had arrived expecting the advantage of surprise, and found instead that he was expected, and was trying to recalculate in real time what that meant for his situation. Kate stayed at the postern entrance and watched through the gap. Aldrich was a broad man in his 40s, in garrison green and a heavy riding cloak, on a dark horse that was better than his men's. He had 4 riders with him, and a 5th who stayed back. The messenger, she realized. The one Evander had let go deliberately on the mountain track. He had done exactly what Evander had known he would do. Gone back to Aldrich, reported the location, and brought him here. To a gate that was open. Into a yard that was not empty. Ringed quietly in the darkness around the yard's perimeter. Visible now that she knew to look. Veldrath's people. Not just Cale and Davin and Rowan. Dozens of them, still and watchful in the cold night air, the breath rising from them in pale clouds. Not armed for battle. Present, simply. Witness. Aldrich looked around the yard and understood, slowly, that what he had ridden into was not an ambush. It was a demonstration. "You have been cutting at the edges of Veldrath's territory for 2 years," Evander said, in the carrying voice that needed no platform to reach every corner of the yard. "Merchant routes, water rights, border posts, and when that proved insufficient, you found a way inside." He did not look at Soren. He did not need to. "You have your answer now. This is what the inside of Veldrath looks like when you arrive uninvited." Aldrich's horse shifted under him. "The ridge is contested territory under—" "The ridge has been Veldrath's for 300 years, Evander said. "The documents exist. The boundary stones exist. The people who have lived here for those 300 years exist." He let a pause settle. "You are a garrison commander who overreached. That is the whole of what this is." A long silence. The cold pressed down. Somewhere above the ridge, the stars were very bright and very indifferent. "Ride back to Ashfen," Evander said. "Report to your authority, not your arrangement, your actual authority, that Veldrath's boundaries are intact and its alpha has returned. That is the message. That is all the message." Aldrich sat very still on his horse for a long moment. A man doing arithmetic. Kate watched his face and saw the exact moment the calculation resolved. Not in Aldrich's favor. Not in any version of this situation. And the anger that followed. And the control that followed that. He turned his horse. His men turned with him. They rode back through the postern and down the ridge path without another word. The sound of hooves on frozen ground, fading slowly into the dark. And then the dark was quiet again, and the cold was simply cold, and the people of Veldrath stood in their yard in the starlight and breathed. Soren did not fight when Cale brought him forward. He looked at Evander with the ruined face of someone who has done a thing he cannot undo and has run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. "He told me you were going to dissolve the pack," Soren said. His voice was unsteady. "Sell the territory. He showed me documents." "Forged," Evander said. "I know that now." Soren's throat moved. "I didn't." Ferris said, "I thought—" He stopped, pressed his eyes closed. Ferris believed him. I believed Ferris. Evander looked at him for a long moment. Kate watched from the doorway, still and silent. "Ferris is gone," Evander said, not harshly, with the weight of something that had already been grieved. "Where he is now is his own matter. You are here." He paused. "You opened the gate, Soren, and you are standing here now instead of riding with them. I see both of those things." Soren looked at the ground. "You'll work the granary through winter," Evander said, "under Mira's supervision. In spring, we discuss the rest." It was not forgiveness. It was not punishment exactly. It was something more complicated. The decision of a man who understood that a pack is not made of perfect people, and that the question of who stays and who goes cannot always be answered cleanly. Cale released Soren's arm. Soren walked away toward the hall, unsteadily, as if the ground were uncertain. Mira appeared at Kate's shoulder. "Well," she said, in the tone of someone who has seen a great many things and is reserving judgment on this one. She looked at Kate. "You knew it was the Eastern Gate." "I guessed," Kate said. "You told Evander 3 hours ago," Mira said. "He moved everyone into position after you went back to your room." She paused. "That was not a guess." Kate said nothing. Outside, the people of Veldrath were dispersing back to their fires, their voices low and ordinary, the particular sound of a community returning to itself after a held breath. The cold settled over the yard, clean and quiet. The stars stayed where they were. Evander walked back through the postern and stopped a few feet from Kate. He looked at her in the way she had come to know, complete, unhurried, the pale eyes taking their time. "Your wrist," she said, because it was the thing she knew how to say. "I should check it in the morning." "Yes," he said. They stood in the cold yard for a moment that had no practical purpose and needed none. "You could stay through winter," he said. "The healer's room needs proper work. The stocks won't last the cold season without someone who knows what they're doing." Kate looked at the hall. Its lit windows, the smoke from its chimneys, the sound of voices settling back into the ordinary rhythms of evening. She thought about the inn with its thin mattress and its 4 nights of credit. She thought about the road south, which was cold and long and led nowhere in particular. She thought about a copper coin, small and worn, already spent. "I'll stay through winter," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was the next true thing, said plainly, and it landed between them the way true things do, without ceremony, and with considerable weight. Evander nodded once. He turned and walked back toward the hall. At the doorway he paused without turning. "Thank you, Kate," he said, quiet, direct. The words stripped to exactly what they were. She stood in the cold yard for a moment after he went inside, her breath rising in small pale clouds. The stars overhead, and the pines dark on the ridge above, and the whole of Veldrath lit and breathing around her. Then she went inside too, and the door closed against the cold, and the night was still. 6 months later, the healer's room was full. Every shelf stocked, every crock labeled in Kate's precise, small handwriting. Dried herbs hanging in tied bundles from the ceiling, scenting the air with yarrow and pine and the clean, sharp bite of willow bark. A proper fire in the small hearth. A second work table added along the eastern wall when the first proved insufficient. Mira had stopped calling it the healer's room. She had begun calling it Kate's room, and then simply Kate's. The way rooms in old houses eventually take the name of the person who has made them their own. Rowan knocked on the open door one morning in early spring, when the snow on the ridge was beginning to pull back from the southern faces, and the first mud of the thaw had turned the yard paths soft. He had a cut on his forearm, and the expression of someone who had been hoping it would resolve itself, and had accepted that it would not. Kate cleaned it and bandaged it, and told him to keep it dry. And he said yes, with the confidence of a man who had been told this before, and had learned, through experience, to mean it. After he left, she stood at the south-facing window and looked out at the ridge. The light was different in spring, softer, and with more color in it, the bare rock above the tree line warming from gray toward something almost amber in the afternoon. She could hear the settlement going about its mourning, the same sounds she had been hearing for 6 months, ordinary and specific, and hers now in the way that a place becomes yours, not through ownership, but through familiarity. She heard his step in the corridor before he appeared in the doorway. She had learned the sound of it over 6 months. Unhurried even. The particular rhythm of someone who moves through the world as if the world were accustomed to accommodating him. Evander stopped at the doorway, the way he always did. He did not come into the room without acknowledging the threshold first. This was something she had noticed early and never remarked on. A form of consideration so habitual it had become invisible to him, but not to her. His wrist had healed completely by the end of October. The scar remained, a pale line beneath the bracer, visible only when he removed it, which she had seen perhaps twice. He no longer came to the healer's room for treatment. He came, occasionally, in the evenings, when the hall was quiet and there was something to discuss. The trade post, the eastern border markers that had been properly restaked in November, Soren's progress through the winter, the letters that had come from Aldrich's actual authority in the capital, stripping him of his commission. Small things, large things wearing the shape of small things. He stood in the doorway now with a folded paper in one hand. "Letter from the capital," he said. "The new garrison commander requests a formal meeting regarding the boundary agreements." "That's good," Kate said. "Yes." He looked at the paper, then at her. "I'll need someone with me who can read a contract and identify where the language is being used against its own meaning." Kate had done this once before, in November, when a merchant from Ashvin had brought a supply agreement with 3 clauses buried in the middle that collectively would have given him control over Veldrath's eastern water access within 2 years. She had found all 3 clauses in under 10 minutes and marked them in the margin in her small, precise hand. Evander had looked at the margins and then at her with an expression she was only now, in retrospect, able to fully identify. "When does the meeting take place?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "In Ashvin." She nodded. She turned back to the window and the spring light and the ridge losing its snow. Behind her, he didn't leave immediately. She could hear him in the doorway, present in the particular way she had come to know over 6 months, not demanding anything, not filling the silence with words it didn't need. Just there. "Evander," she said. "Yes, the coin." She said it quietly, to the window. "The one I spent at the auction. I've thought about it. I used to think it was the last thing I owned. But I think it was actually the first thing I gave away on purpose." She paused. "There's a difference." A silence that was not empty. "There is," he said. She turned from the window. He was watching her from the doorway, with the pale blue eyes that had looked at her across a torchlit auction hall 6 months ago, and paused, for just half a second, when everyone else had looked away. The fur mantle was on his shoulders again now that the cold still held in the mornings, and the dark braids fell past his shoulders, and the scar was under his bracer where she had put the bandage with her own hands on a cold stone floor, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, as if she were worth the full attention of his looking. "Come back from the window," he said quietly. "There's a meeting to prepare for." She came away from the window, and the room was warm, and the herbs hung drying from the ceiling, and outside the ridge was thawing into spring, and nothing was perfect, and everything was real. And that, Kate had decided a long time ago, was the only kind of life worth living anyway.